Can you see my slides? Okay, so I can't see any faces when. Okay, great. Okay. Hi everyone. First, thank you, Anirudh, for the introduction. I think I've met some of you, but just to kind of repeat, um, my name, of course, is Neha Kumar, and I'm joint faculty here in the School of International Affairs and School of Interactive Computing. So this is an odd combination, but really the work that I do is in the space of human-centered computing and global development. And some folks call it ICTD, which is short for Information and Communication Technologies and Development within the HCI, which here at Georgia Tech, there are basically two schools, one school that focuses on HCI and everything HCI, and the other that has the global development focus. So that's where my appointment sits. And I'm going out, and this is kind of my fault that I didn't send you something to read beforehand, and so I was wondering how I could do a talk that was a little more general. And I looked at some of the talks you had heard. Of course, I think Nikki Dell might have actually spoken a little bit about the field, but what I thought was that I could go over ICTD as a field and ICTD conference, and essentially talk about the evolution of this as a field through the years, and then talk a little bit about how and what that means for the kind of work that we do. And then finally, I will go over the paper that Nikki and I wrote on the ins and outs of HCI for development. This was published at CHI 2016, but it basically where the field has been and where it's headed, or at least it aims to capture. And so that was a kind of a review of 259 publications with the hope of understanding kind of through the years where the field has been. Where the field of ICTD started, at least as I know it, right? It's commonly understood to have kind of begun with this article by Eric Brewer, and his colleagues at UC Berkeley, which was titled "The Case for Technology in Regions." And this is, at this point, I would say it is a seminal article. It is a basic article. It's basically saying that there's many ways in which we can think about technology and development. Certainly not a brand new notion, because we're making a case for ICTs in particular. And so it aligns with kind of UN visions, and that's how it frames itself, talking about, in Kofi Annan's terms, I hope the industry will broaden its horizon and bring more of its remarkable dynamism, making available the benefits of new technologies, especially ICTs. And this is akin to many other fields that have looked at global development, right? So you can imagine that when there are changes in, say, mechanical engineering or in design or in understand how those kinds of advancements could be of benefit to people in less served regions. And likewise has been the case in this field, because as ICTs became more popular, there were changes. People thought about these in the context of underserved regions. So how has the conference really kind of evolved over time? And this is sort of a study that I did just for my own kind of personal interest, because a, kind of a transition over time in terms of what kind of work was being accepted at the conference and what was the flavor of that work. essentially. So I'll go over that kind of briefly. This is, the very first ICTD that happened in 2006, and this was at Berkeley. And there was a strong focus on establishing that ICTs had a role to play in different domains, so ranging from agricultural extension to rural supply chains, the fishing industry, livestock, and governance. So affordable at that point. So there was much more of a focus on, different ways of working with and around expensive technologies, and focusing on the challenges that limited literacies imposed. And this is a time when there was a lot of research expensive and how groups of people really engaged with them. And then there was also some work that compared across developed and developing contexts, and talking about the importance of human-driven design in ICTD. In 2000, devices. So there was the Varana Unwired project, which was driven by Microsoft Research, and it was looking at moving from desktops to mobile devices. And Digital Green's highly cited paper was published this year. It's still considered a project that we love to hate, and that was that also entered the ICTD discourse. There were novel user interfaces that were discussed. So, for instance, a Braille writing tutor, the use of videos for education, on considering trade-offs between welfare and agency. So that's sort of the first touch of kind of a critical perspective on looking at technology that came up. The next ICTD, which took place in 2009, there was much more of a focus on games. That we should decide what people from underprivileged contexts should be really engaging with. Instead, we should think about how they would like to adopt technologies and on their own terms. And that then kind of brought out this focus on the non-instrument engaged to consume information on their own terms. And then in 2010, there was a focus on going beyond information provision alone. So an understanding that so much we can do if we only try to understand how information can be provided, we need to think about the power dynamics that are at play. And this is also the year when HCI made a much more kind of active interfaces, so paper and pen, and a slate. And then the Open Data Kit, ODK, was first introduced into the conversation. And this is a project that is a pretty massive project, and also because this project was really kind of launched by them. And then looking at multi-user education. And the next ICTD was in 2012, and this was in Atlanta. I was not here then, and I actually did not attend this conference, but certainly there was much more of a focus, as I said, on the critical aspects of doing this work. So ethics made an appearance for the first time, and people started to look at more participatory approaches. And trying to understand failure. So there was an event called Fail Fair, if I remember correctly, which really talked about why projects in this space fail, so that we can better understand how to succeed. And then there was a focus on intermediated access, so looking at health workers who are kind of middle persons, middle layer, responsible for mediating interventions between, say, state and healthcare authorities and people in local communities. And then in 2013, one of my favorite papers, actually, and I would highly recommend that you read this, was by Meena Natarajan and Tapan Parekh, on understanding barriers to information. And this is, I would say, the first kind of piece that critiques the role of mobile health technologies and says, well, there's only so much that you can do if you only think about information dissemination, right? And even if you think about how to package information dissemination, you can say that you want it to be more culturally appropriate and such, but there's still only so much you can do with giving out information. And so there were papers also that looked at ludic design, so thinking about different ways of packaging that information, and then questioning when the technology doesn't fit, what do you do? And then one of the papers, again, which was kind of key in this conference, was a paper by Janaki Srinivasan and Jenna Burrell, which was revisiting a study done in 2006 by Robert Jensen, which had said that the fisher folk in Kerala would be able to improve their livelihoods by using mobile devices. And so this study in 2013 was basically challenging that earlier study to say that we cannot actually say for sure. We cannot make that claim. Yes, it may have been observed to play out in a certain way, but this was kind of an ethnographic study done in Kerala that showed that there's more complexities that need to be understood. So overall, by this point, I would say that there was much more of a turn towards the critical, towards understanding all of the different kind of sociocultural and power-related factors that shape the adoption, the use, the design, the deployment of technologies. It wasn't just about here we have technology and we can solve this problem that is impacting millions of people around the world. Now, in 2015, a lot of the narrative became about thinking about sustainability. So how do we think about projects that go beyond just a pilot stage? How do we make them last for years? What are the things that make them last? And there weren't any more kind of kiosk and desktop projects, because by this point everything had become about the mobile device. And then in 2016, the conference took place in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And this is when there was much more of an entrance of the technology industry in this discourse. And this probably was because Facebook, Google, in addition to Microsoft already, had been really focusing on how to capitalize on emerging markets, right? So what is the role that technology can play in the in furthering these spaces? So Google, for instance, was looking at internet and what internet meant in rural parts of India. And there was a discussion about free basics that Facebook had tried to introduce through its internet.org initiative. And there was much more of kind of a discussion of a STS, or a science and technology studies perspective, which looked at gender, women, critical agency, looking at repair and such. So this is the focus kind of again broadened and deepened and included the tech industry as well. And then ICTD took place in Pakistan. I wasn't able to attend, but there was this conference in particular saw a focus on localized interventions. So not thinking so much about kind of international collaborations as much, and maybe that was a function of the fact that it was taking place in Lahore, but there were many projects that were really driven locally by local organizations, whether it was looking at refugees or looking at cellular networks, but the focus was on local. And then in 2019, when the conference took place in Ahmedabad, there's much more of the same, I would say, but it was truly interdisciplinary in the sense that there were projects that looked at these long-term deployment deployments. So the sustainable type projects that I just mentioned. There were also projects that were looking at HCI, so thinking about interfaces in different ways. There were projects that were looking at gender from a critical lens. Demonetization was another aspect that was looked at. So there's many different kind of focus areas that emerged during this conference, which also kind of raises interesting questions around, is that one space really the space to be, or should we be thinking about kind of diversifying and deepening the discourse to focus on certain areas? Okay, so that's sort of the overview, I would say, of the field until 2019. And the question kind of, I spoke about interdisciplinarity, and this is a question that comes up often with regards to ICTD research. And I will tell you that, having been on the program committee for a few different conferences, ICTD tends to be actually the hardest to appease people from different disciplines. And this is understandable because you have people from very different perspectives looking at these papers, and generally it's hard for them to kind of see eye to eye. And there was an interesting debate that happened back in 2009 between Kentaro Toyama and Jenna Burrell. So Kentaro was coming from a very kind of tech-driven standpoint, and Jenna Burrell is an anthropologist, really a social anthropologist. And their discussion was really around, when we do this interdisciplinary work, how do we make sure that the work is good? And what does good really mean? So that was the question that they asked: what constitutes good ICTD research? And I'll go over this a little bit briefly. So this is a paper. It's not a research paper, but it is kind of a short paper that speaks to the tensions across the field of ICTD. So I'm reading a quote from the paper now. These tensions between disciplinary worldviews can have a balancing, even creative effect, making the field stronger, richer, and more varied. Even when one disagrees with a discipline's foundational premises, a mature intellect should still be able to dispassionately absorb and evaluate the value of work built in that context, while perhaps remaining doubtful, even critical of the context. In the same way that a Baroque architect should still be able to appreciate the beauty and coherence of Angkor Wat. What is crucial is that we agree on ways to distinguish differences in approach and perspective from inadequately carried out research practice. The present confusion in demarcating one from the other is a source of angst and animosity in many interdisciplinary communities. So this speaks to kind of one of the key tensions that exists in the community, is just how do we think differently, act differently, approach technology differently, but still stay together in the same community. Magically, it's happened, so far, but it's certainly something that we all have to contend with in these interdisciplinary spaces. And then about the paper and what led to this discourse. In our original exchange, Toyama used the terms rigor and replicability instead of sound and transparent methodology. Through discussion, we found that the former words are loaded with additional connotations in some communities. Rigor is sometimes taken to mean quantitative, and replicability immediately suggests lab experiments where die-cut identical results are to be had from identical methodologies, a particularly difficult end to achieve when dealing with dynamic environments, as well as the unique effects that a researcher necessarily has on her or his human subjects. Neither of these nuances, though, was intended by Toyama originally. Therefore, we looked for terms without the baggage and felt that transparency and soundness of method fit our criteria. It's our hope that every ICT discipline values these traits. And so this is just kind of an example of the ways in which we think differently across the field, and how we need to come to terms with these different epistemological stances. So how do we create knowledge that people kind of really recognize as knowledge? And so, I didn't assign this as reading, but if you're interested in learning more about the field of ICTD, just to understand what these interdisciplinary tensions are and how we make sense of them, then this is a good paper to look at. So essentially, let me just quickly summarize this. So there are things that they agree on, right, which goes to the core of what this research is about. So there is an importance given to accuracy, to transparency, to rigor, and then there are points of contention which have to do with problems versus values. So do we focus on problems and taking a solutionist approach that, okay, this is a problem we see, whether it's with regards to gender or health or education, and we want to find a solution to it, so taking a solutionist approach, which has been critiqued in good measure? Or do we think about the values that people have in their, whether it's their individual values or values of an organization or a community or a culture? How do we make that the centerpiece, and then think about technology and design around that? Right. And then there's also different views of development. And this is something that, well, I certainly am teaching a class on Intro to Global Development this semester. So this is something we've talked about a lot, about just how development started out in the post World War II era, where the goal was really to take the examples of economic growth in the so-called global north or in the west, and introduce those to countries in the global south, right? So in Asia, in Africa, in parts of Europe. And um, over time, there have been approaches that have critiqued that view, saying that we don't need to replicate the products of the West. We need to think about what is appropriate for countries, for communities, for cultures. And that's been a post development turn to kind of understand how we focus on what is really relevant for communities and cultures and countries, as opposed to taking this old kind of monetarily focused view of development, which is just forcing a certain way of growth. And so with that, I want to go into speaking about HCI for development in particular. And this is, as I said, this is a paper that we wrote for CHI 2016. And it was really written when, neither of us, Nikki nor me, were faculty. And we were finishing up, I was finishing up my postdoc, she was doing her PhD. And we were trying to wrap our heads around the field, really, to understand what are the big problems that we should be looking at right now? What are the ways in which we can think about growing the field? And so we did a survey of papers. We also did some interviews. And what I'm going to present to you next is basically the presentation that we'd given for this talk. And so you'll see, since you're doing interaction design, you might be sensitive to these things. You'll see that the slide template is different, but hopefully that shouldn't matter. So this was kind of the talk that we gave. And in terms of the goals of the exercise that we went through, right? So we were interested in looking at both the insiders and outsiders to the community. So we wanted to give a concise, a high-level overview of the domain to take stock of the current state of HCI 4D and look at the increasing depth and breadth of the field. And then also we were interested in kind of the insights that we could offer to the community that had been learned from a decade of grappling with this idea of HCI and development, or HCI and social good, and is it for development or and development, and all that. So we did a survey of basically 6 years of work from 2009 to 2014. And in this, we also added on to other perspectives that people had given in various works and across different publication venues that were trying to inform the work of HCI researchers. And this is especially critical for a field like HCI 4D because it's extremely messy. And when you're doing work in messy locations, that doesn't mean that it cannot be rigorous, but it does mean that that rigor needs to be communicated in ways that people who have already been doing HCI for many, many years and feel like they have a pretty good handle of the field, they need to be introduced differently. So that's kind of the focus of many of these papers that talk about stories from the field, talking about how it is messy, talking about how it's very important to think about how we engage with communities that are different from researchers or are from different contexts. And I will say that this is probably true even if you're doing this work living right next to the community where you're doing it. There's still a distance between the researcher or the designer and the people being designed for and with. And so at whatever level you kind of think about that difference, it will matter, right? So what we did for this paper was we did an online survey, and this was a survey that was distributed on mailing lists that were HCI 4D mailing lists, to the best of our knowledge at that point. And we got 36 responses, and the goal of this was essentially to do a 3-minute survey just to ask, well, what publication venues have you submitted your work to in the last few years? I think it was 5 years. And where would you want to see it published in the next 5 years? And so looking at those, we basically took the top 10 publication venues, but at 10th place, there were 2 that were tied, so we considered 11. And then we went through all of the papers, looking at the entire programs of all of those venues since 2009. And first, made a list of about 400 papers, I think, and then brought it down to 259, which seemed to fulfill a certain set of criteria that we kind of developed along the way that that counted for us as HCI 4D work. So at the intersection of HCI and ICTD. Next, we also did qualitative interviews with 11 quote-unquote expert researchers, and these were basically people who had been doing research in the field of ICTD and had published in that field, HCI4D, over many years. And so they had some perspective to offer on what the field had been, where it was going, what were the key tensions in the field, and such. So in terms of kind of the bird's eye view, we found that there were, over the years, the number of papers had grown, the number of venues had diversified. There are certain factors that kind of played into this. So for instance, Interact was in South Africa one year, and so that made a difference. In that year, there were a lot of papers. And so location of the conference or the venue mattered. And then certain venues would happen every 2 years, like the ICTD conference actually doesn't take place every year, but takes place every 18 months or so. So that made a difference. But overall, the number was increasing over time, and now certainly it has gone up quite a bit. And then these were the venues that we looked at. So certainly the ICTD conference, but also at CHI, the number had gone up by a lot. DEV was a conference that was started soon after ICTD, but it has now been renamed to COMPASS, which stands for Computing and Sustainable Societies. And that's a shift that has tried to integrate a lot of other voices, so voices looking at data science and ML and AI and social good across not just so-called developing countries, but across the world. Okay, so these were the venues, and certainly the picture is changing quite rapidly. And then in terms of just where this work was published, right, most of it was Asia. In fact, most of it was India. And a lot of it, there's a paper that in fact is simply devoted to talking about how MSR in India as a lab really facilitated a lot of this work and the conversations to bring India into much more of a focus in this work. And then there's, of course, Africa as a whole continent. There's a lot of work that's still coming out of there. There are some questions around whether they would really want to call this work HCI4D, or is it just HCI? And this is a question we can come back to later. It's related to the politics of the term development and what it has meant since the post-World War II era that I talked about, and what it means today. In terms of target populations, um, looking at ground level users, but also human access points. So human access points could be people who are responsible for introducing to technology. So say workers at kiosks and such, collective entities. So it's not just individuals, but also organizations trying to make use of certain technologies, right? Like deploying um, different technologies, different mobile-based technologies for collecting data. So the unit of analysis then becomes the organization as opposed to a group of people. And then looking much more generally at users without any particular identity in focus. So those were the target populations. Most of this work was qualitative. Some of it was quantitative, and then a good number of papers were using mixed methods. And certainly over time, there has been more and more of a use of mixed methodology. In terms of the technology and the interface, this is where things start to get interesting, where you kind of see, and I alluded to this, that the focus much more used to be kind of these shared devices and such in the early period of the survey. So using PCs or laptops or DVDs and such, which then were phased out by the basic or the feature phone, and slowly the smartphone. And now if you look at the work, a lot of it would be, a majority of it would really focus on smartphones. What were the focus areas? And this is no surprise, because this is really kind of how the development goals by the UN and such are also focused. Everything looks at education kind of first and foremost. And this can be formal education, so looking at learning in particular ways, or it can be informal education. So not necessarily looking at the classroom, but looking outside of the classroom, looking at communities, looking at learning about health, or looking at learning in terms of literacies or digital literacies. All of that was work that we classified as education. And then a lot of work looked at access issues. This is also something that has shifted over time, where we're looking at, I guess, deeper issues than purely around access to information or access to technology. And then health was a strong third, which basically looked at um, how how people gain access to healthcare at the quote unquote ground level, but also community health workers are a big part of this literature. And then looking at community-based organizations or rural clinics and such that have looked at bringing health access to healthcare to marginalized communities. And then there were an interesting set of topic areas that surfaced. So data has become a much bigger focus, looking at data collection mechanisms, but also looking at the politics around data, looking at the location of data and such. These are very current topics even now. There's entertainment and more leisure-driven use of technology, which was a term that I already alluded to. But basically, thinking about technology not from the perspective of what the designer or the researcher might want to introduce in a technology, but really thinking about it from the perspective of how people would like to make use of that technology, whether it is for fun and games or it is for learning and education and improving their livelihood. Moving on. So here I'll talk about kind of what we learned from the experience of the folks that we interviewed, right? And this was really perhaps an unusual aspect of the paper that we wrote, because a lot of the review papers, they don't generally kind of engage in a qualitative investigation of the field by talking to people who are in the field, right? But in this case, what we found was that we didn't know a lot of the history, and different people came with different perspectives around what had been the past or what could be the future of HCI development. And so this was a really good exercise in terms of just learning different perspectives, but also trying to consolidate that into key questions that the community was facing. right? So I'll talk about it basically in two chunks. One, the ground that we've covered thus far as a community, and then the road that lies ahead, the challenges that we might face. So we organized our findings around four key themes. So first, what understanding what exactly HCI4D means. Second, discussing how the community has evolved and how it might continue to grow. Third, identifying major trends in HCI4D research, so in technologies, human infrastructures, research contributions that have influenced HCI4D work. And four, deconstructing notions of development as they pertain to this work. So what exactly is HCI4D? And we found that HCI4D at once represents many things to these participants. A body of work looking at particular populations or places that HCI has maybe neglected, a community of scholars spread across the world with common research interests, a keyword for publications, a club defined by strong Euro-American values, socially motivated computing, and a natural progression of work that goes back to when technology was first seen as kind of a cure for underdeveloped economies. It is maybe just a new name for an old idea. And this also I alluded to, that there were ideas that were already in the making that kind of took on a different face. And many refer to it as a crossing over of disciplines such as computer science, social science, and design, with the common goal of making technology more accessible to people who have so far been excluded. Right. So the question of how has the field evolved in these few years, and we heard that though it had, critical mass was missing. So there was a need for more focused community efforts. Suggestions that we received were along the lines of organizing conferences differently so that people in developing countries or the global south had the resources to attend, as well as allowing for remote participation and encouraging new ways of community interaction and knowledge sharing. And then we took a small step towards this goal over the few years that the last few years, to try to organize a community around doing HCI across borders. But it is hard. It's hard because it is expensive and the world is a big place, and you are going to have to deal with the challenges that come with working across time zones, working across different incentive structures for research and such. Right, so all of those are challenges that need to be understood, if not addressed. And then HCI4D work has moved towards being less technologically deterministic than before. So with people calling BS on the hype, that's what one of the participants said. And it aims for now a more nuanced and more holistic view of the role of technology in development. And increasingly people are asking, should we even think about technology, right? Should we be introducing technology? As one participant said, we have a much more realistic way of thinking about the role of technology in the context of everything else and the broader space. And then, what are the trends that have shaped HCI 4D research? So there's certainly computing trends, right? We found that smartphones are a step back in many ways, and the trend towards smartphones, as our survey showed, concerned the participants because smartphones do not have the same profile and robustness as basic phones. So an Android phone will last for 2 years compared to a basic Nokia phone that would last for 10. The ecosystem has expanded to other issues such as battery life, robustness, sustainability, power, OS updates, and more. And this is certainly something that came up a lot in our findings, but at this point, we would say that we've pretty much accepted that smartphones are what they are, right? So it's sort of a technology that has achieved closure in some ways for now, where we see that, yes, there are some trends, some ways in which this technology is changing, but more or less it is going to be what it is. And yes, they're not going to be as robust as Nokia phones were considered to be in the past, but people are more or less kind of at ease with them. And then there's also also the human trends, right? So these are the kind of slower changes in human infrastructures. So as one participant said, just because the physical infrastructure has improved doesn't mean the human infrastructure has improved. Those things don't change overnight. And then another said, I think one of the encouraging trends is that for a long time we were thinking of the user as the consumer of information. But in the last few years, they've become the producer of content. So IVR is just one example, but that is allowing them to do that. Now, the question, and this comes up all the time, really, is HCI4D really for development? What does the D mean? And one of the differences we heard, um, some of our participants shared, HCI is about publishing early, while development studies do deep, patient, slow evaluations. Thus, HCI4D often stirs the imagination, but doesn't go all the way to development. We publish and we move on to a new project, even if there is the aspiration to do more. And this is also a question of kind of what are we going to be able to publish and such, right? Then there was a comment about outputs and outcomes. So first, we should show an output that suggests some kind of impact or influence. Then second, show that this output could lead to an outcome. The most successful is to go all the way to an outcome. But all three are contributions. They all have a special role in science. If you're actually changing an outcome and showing it, then that has a great deal of weight, but it can take years. And this is something to think about as well, that we don't know what it means to achieve kind of zero hunger, right? But there are many milestones along the way that we can try to think about and see how they will chart the way to that eventual goal. And it's extremely hard if you start with zero hunger and then think about how you're going to achieve that. So this is a tension that is constantly coming up. And then with regards to the road ahead, right, there were kind of questions that our participants raised. So how can we further build capacity? And there are already efforts underway across parts of the world. How can we broaden the scope of HCI for development, and also recognize that it isn't about contexts always that are in some faraway marginalized location. Sometimes they're right next door. And then how can we engage with a wider audience and be more a part of mainstream HCI work, such that we don't have to always kind of add on the 4D, right? What would it take for HCI to also equally be representative of the global South? And then how can we design for non-traditional settings? That's a key question, non-traditional, non-dominant user groups. And how can we improve interactions for diverse users? So speaking about just a couple of these, like how can we design for non-traditional settings? Many of our participants call for a stronger focus on designing for non-traditional computing environments. And what do they look like, right? So one participant asked, for instance, why would you have an Office, QWERTY keyboard, desktop metaphor, textual interface for people who don't think about things in that way? The traditional appliances and systems embed middle-aged white guys from the Pacific Northwest. They are the ones in the corner office whose language is premised in QWERTY. The appliance is really focused on that context, and no wonder it can be alienating to different contexts. HCI4D is about breaking out of these rich white male US systems into all kinds of other systems, right? And then how can we improve interactions for diverse users who speak, who read, and think and engage with technologies that are different ways from one another? So one of the key points that came up as a participant shared was leveraging voice, right? So the whole spoken assistant thing is interesting. It's completely a first world app, but it could be so huge for poor, low literate people. We also heard that it would be extremely challenging to internationalize these services for diverse populations around the world. And this is an ongoing research problem, thinking about language. So you can internationalize a GUI fairly easily. If you want to internationalize Siri or Cortana, it's basically impossible. The cost of internationalizing these personal assistants, I don't think people have appreciated this yet. Okay, so I only briefly went over the findings from this, but for the main takeaways of this work, right? Our findings basically show the movement from preliminary research to substantive bodies of work that are trying to make an impact, and an impact in different ways. And that's something that we need to think about. So impact evaluations are not just about social change, because that also takes a long time. The only way that we're going to know that we're on our way there is to be able to create some of these kind of intermediate milestones for us to understand how we're making progress. And then how we're making progress both intellectually and as a community as well. And where we need to focus to continue this advancement, right? So in 2016, where this paper was published, the focus of the conference was really on Kai for good and thinking about social good. And there are many different groups within the HCI community that are thinking about social good. It's not at all just HCI4D, right? People who think about sustainability issues, people who think about social justice, people who think about developing technology for accessibility issues. So how do we think about all of these different subparts within the HCI community and also build bridges? And okay, so with this, I wanted to kind of just briefly touch upon some of the kind of bigger, much bigger chunks that we can have impact in if we bring a richer, grounded perspective from the ICTD, HCID world. So one area that we've been looking at is makerspaces and how makerspaces serve as sites for innovation, but really how they can be hubs for generating community knowledge networks. And this is a space that two of my students started in Powai, and so I really wanted to mention this. It's called Maker Cart, and it's basically a makerspace that caters to some of the schools and communities around Powai, trying to do workshops that are around design thinking, trying to create artifacts, like do things with their hands and make, but also think about how that making connects with what are the urgent, relevant, current needs of nearby communities. So the crux of this is really to think about how technology is driven by the communities that need it, as opposed to researchers and designers, and how do we kind of minimize the role of the latter and maximize the role of the former. This is something that I've been actively thinking about. So the intersection between sustainability and development, and it's more kind of in the theoretical right now, but there's certainly a lot to be done in the empirical realm. So thinking about where sustainability issues and sustainable development intersect and where they are at odds with each other, because we cannot keep growing in economic terms um, if we still care about sustainability. And how do we think about that kind of growth by keeping in mind that we have limited resources? Another aspect of this work actually that is really interesting is that the world in general is starting to look at SDGs much more actively. And I feel like this is a place where countries in the global south have an advantage, because the MDGs that came before the Sustainable Development Goals, which were the Millennium Development Goals, we were already familiar with them, we were already trying to address them. And the SDGs were introduced to not only include those quote unquote developing countries, but also the developed world. And so countries like the US and many European countries are now starting to see these goals as important for them. But this is a space that we have already been understanding in the space of global sustainable development. And so what can we offer in this regard is something to consider. And finally, human-centered AI. Uh, the public discourse around this is that there's a lot that's possible with AI. People are looking at it in the context of social good. People are looking at it in the context of ML4D. But a lot of these conversations don't quite know how to make data relevant or useful in the context of many communities that don't have that tech infrastructure. And so how do we think about these spaces of data science, human-centered AI, or ML4D as really being much more equitable, much more representative of the world. So that's, I think, a key challenge that we're currently seeing, and there's a lot that we can contribute from this space there. Okay, so those were three really high level areas, but I think that there's a lot that can be done in those, so I wanted to mention those. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I wanted to thank all of these participants for the research that I was presenting from the Ins and Outs paper. And with that, I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'm happy to take any.
Questions? Questions?
That was a lot of talking. I generally don't talk nonstop for this long in my classes, but unfortunately, in the remote setting, it's a little bit hard to make it more interactive.
Go for it.
Okay, fine. So,
Questions?
you've spoken a bit about interdisciplinarity, and for us in one sense, we're coming in a design school. We're slowly beginning to sort of realize the rigor of other fields. So I was wondering where you see the role of design, which usually in at least a corporate setting is relegated to doing very surface level work, comes into.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Can you maybe?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll come close. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
it's
better
audible?
now.
Yeah.
Say again.
Right. So I was wondering what you thought of the role of design in this space of HCI for development. Considering two things. One is looking at sort of.
No, I'm not able to hear
Okay.
anything. Let me stop the video. Okay, try again.
Right. Yeah. I'll start. I'll speak also very slowly. Right. So my question was related to what your views on the role of designer in the space of HCI for development. Looking at sort of two different things. One is sort of how in the industry designers end up usually filling mostly UI, sometimes we're lucky UX-based roles, and otherwise on the other end, some fundamental research in HCI4D ends up becoming very simple in terms of the interfaces that are designed. Where I mean, coming from a design school, then the question is, how can design skills help?
I only heard. Oh gosh, I only heard bits and pieces of what you said.
Is the internet connection?
Can you maybe type
Yeah, sure.
in the chat? I think what you were asking was the role of design, but I couldn't capture the rest of the of what you said. But I think design has a massive role to play, except I don't know in what context you were asking. So I can, if you can share that, I can answer. Okay, so interdisciplinarity in the case of design and
You also speak here. Okay, okay. We're trying this is different literacy levels. Okay, right. Is okay. I'll try it once again. Yeah. Is it this mic though? I'm not sure. This one. Okay. So in terms of between all these different fields, what has your impression of design been, or your interaction with designers been like?
Yeah, I will say that we're very behind on design, and I think that there's a huge role to play there, right? Because these are not, most of these works are not around good design, and one can understand why that might be the case, because people might think that design is sort of the cherry on top, right? And we think about functionality and such, but actually I would say, in line with what I said about games and leisure driven use, that design is really what makes people what creates appeal, whether it's for technologies or it's for data or what have you. And so that appeal can be really powerful when it comes to uh, packaging information, when it comes to attracting people to use and adopt technology. So just to put it in kind of crude terms, uh, ICTD, HCI4D kind of have talked a lot about making information accessible. But I think accessibility is not enough. What needs to happen is that information needs to be packaged in a way that appeals. And I think that's where design has a really, really massive role to play.
Right, thanks. Anyone else? Questions?
Knowledge. So Neha, this is Anirudh. I had a question. Actually, sort of takes off from the earlier question which Rohan asked, which was so you mentioned this issue that the ICTD community has with this word solutionism.
Mm-hmm.
And so very often when I read about the critique or the problem that people seem to have with finding solutions is it sounds like a sort of a straw man argument, because it sort of seems to say that people jump into solutions, or they want to find a solution for everything, and as if that is a bad thing. So being a designer, I would sort of, I sometimes feel like challenging this notion, because uh, ultimately, unless we are able to find solutions, describing problems ad nauseum is not going to get us anywhere. I mean, I'm sort of trying to be a critique of a solutionism approach, basically, or critique of
Hmm.
solutionism. So, which is that unless at some stage you look for solutions, uh, what is the point of all of this, anyways? Uh,
Yeah.
and and then if that is the if solutions are to be found, then why wait until you find each and every problem? I'm just now putting the other strawman argument. So why wait until you find each and every problem until you start looking for solutions? So I mean, do you,
Hmm.
having particularly talked to so many people in the field and looked at so much literature, do you see not finding solutions as a problem in some cases?
Yeah, and I had an interesting conversation about that actually with Jenna, right? So, and so this is just a personal exchange that I will share, but it did stay with me for a while. So Jenna, as a social anthropologist, was very much about observing and not changing anything in a community. And she was doing work in Ghana, in rural Ghana. And what came out of that conversation, I remember many years after she had finished that work, she said that she was very careful to not try and change anything in the field site that she was in. But years down the line, what she realized was for her own self that she had basically gotten tenure off of the work that she had done. It had benefited her greatly, but all of those years that she had spent in her field site had not really done anything to benefit the people there. And so this was something that was hard for her kind of personally to deal with. um, I think that HCI has been good about thinking critically about what we are contributing to our communities when we do work with them. At least more recently, there's been a turn to do that. And so I think that that's important. With regards to solutionism, I'll give you an example of a project that some of my students did. So they were looking at food waste, and then to cut food waste from, say, restaurants and other like food places or joints, they wanted to deploy an AI based solution, right? So basically generating data on how much food was wasted over time, and resources that they needed and all of that. And I think that finding a very niche solution to a problem that might be much more widely scoped is probably not the best design. And so I would say that if one is engaging in good design from, like, from a grounded perspective, then probably what you're saying totally holds, that it's not a solutionist mindset. It's really just a question of finding um, responsible solutions or careful solutions and such. But one has to be careful to not jump in without understanding that there are many other factors at play. There can be social and cultural dynamics, there can be sustainability issues, there is a cost to the resources that we generate. So I think it's just about balance, right? I agree that if you're not looking for solutions to problems, then why are you in this space to begin with? And a lot of people feel that way. But I think there's value to both sides of the argument, and therefore it's probably good to be kind of a moderate and think about both sets of concerns when we do our work. And I think that that's totally possible in doing design.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, this is Deepak. So one of the things that you spoke about is about technology infrastructure is improving, but the human infrastructure is not yet improved with our technologies. So my question is, like, as an ICT researcher, like say researcher, should we develop human infrastructure to adapt to latest technologies, or should our technologies is that simpler so that the current human infrastructure could adapt? So how do you see this going?
I think different people might give a different answer to this. If I understand your question correctly, I would say that uh, changing the way that humans do things is harder than changing technology. And this we see in bodies of work within HCI on behavior change, right? Looking at health related behavior change or fitness level related behavior change. And so, as much as possible, if we are able to craft our technological solutions or devices to scaffold people's existing behaviors, that would probably be the approach that I would recommend first. But also recognizing that if we had all of the practices in place already, why would we be doing that work or doing that research? So a little bit of new and a lot of the old, I would say, would be a more dependable approach.
If you turn the camera and please try. So, hi. So, thank you very much, Neha. It's been great to have you, and it was lovely to kind of go through your perspectives on this. And I'll see you in Hawaii soon.
Yes, I will. Thank you all for your patience. It was nice to see you. Bye.
Bye.